talking with Darrell Bock about the New Testament and Jesus. Darrell, the Apostle Paul's received a lot of bad press. He's the guy who perverted Christianity. Christianity was originally this Jewish reform movement based around a lovely teacher called Jesus. Paul comes along and makes it a sort of pagan religion with this exalted Jesus. So there are two Christianities, and we happen to have inherited the bad one that Paul invented. Is this true?
Not at all. Actually, names associated with the more Jewish Christianity, like Peter, have an exalted Jesus as well. He writes in his own first epistle about how Jesus is exalted above all the powers and authorities. This is in chapter 3 of 1 Peter. And so we have an exalted Jesus in Jewish Christianity. That's important, and people forget that. The differences that exist between the more Gentile-oriented Christianity and the Jewish Christianity are differences that are the result of concerns about how to reach out to people. In Judaism, in Jewish Christianity, there was a concern that people remain somewhat Jewish and faithful with regard to the covenant as they did their outreach to talk about Jesus being the Messiah. And this produced a church in Jerusalem that is described, quite honestly, in Acts as being fairly orthodox in its practices. That's in contrast to places in the Gentile world where those concerns didn't exist quite to such a great degree, and so these practices weren't as important to be kept, and so there was more freedom that was allowed. Paul writes himself and says, with regard to days and food, don't fight. Don't fight over those differences. Everyone gets to choose according to their conscience, but the central doctrine remains the same. So the differences that we see in first century Christianity are not differences of doctrine, they're differences in practice and in missionary outreach strategy.
But some would say that Paul's exalted Jesus uses Greco-Roman categories and language to have Jesus much larger than a Jewish teacher.
Well, if you're going to blame Paul for an exalted Jesus, then you've got to blame Jesus for an exalted Jesus. Because Jesus is the one who, before the Sanhedrin at his trial, and I spent a year studying this one event, says to those who ask him if he's the Messiah, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Father. For a Jewish person to say that is making a very exalted claim. He's not only claiming that he can walk into the Holy of Holies in the temple on earth in Jerusalem and go to a place that no one can walk in except the high priest once a year. He's saying God's going to vindicate me in such a way that He's going to show what my status is, and my status is at His very right hand, and I share the throne and the glory of God. That's a very exalted claim. Paul got that, I think, from Jesus. So if you're going to blame Jesus for an exalted Jesus, go to the source and blame Jesus Himself.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.